Welcome back to another episode of the Twin Elements podcast, proudly presented by Venture Hunting and Outdoors. If you're like us and passionate about hunting, spearfishing, and many other outdoor-related pursuits, with an eagerness to fast-track your learning, then this podcast is perfect for you. G'day legends, and welcome back to another episode of the Twin Elements podcast. Today we are continuing with the theme of Australia's Northern Territory, following on from last week's episode, The Honey Hole. Today we're going to be jumping into some top tips and considerations when planning on hunting, fishing or adventuring in Australia's top end. So having lived in the NT for the last couple of years, hunted there many times over a longer period of time, and wanting to continue to do so long into the future, we figured that we would share with you some things that we consider to be important when planning that next trip or tackling that next hunt in the Northern Territory. We're also going to touch on some FAQs which have been sent in. If you have a question, please email us at info@twinelements.com.au. Please add the subject line FAQ, or simply send us a DM on Instagram through either Twin Elements, Ayden Doumtsis Outdoors, or James Doumtsis Outdoors, and we will get back to you as soon as possible with a bit of a insight into your question. Without further ado, we'll get into the podcast.
Venture Hunting and Outdoors is Australia's premier hunting retailer, with the mission to give Australian outdoorsmen and women the resource they deserve. Venture started from a team of passionate hunters and has transformed into a community. Through group events, top quality gear, exclusive deals, and expert guidance, Venture is more than a hunting store. Check out their website today to see what epic deals are available.
So straight off the top, today, one of the main considerations when considering a hunt or adventure into the Northern Territory is looking into, I guess, what we call DIY, so do-it-yourself adventures, compared with existing operations that are conducted or done through either like guides or outfitters. And it is worth mentioning that DIY trips are very possible. I guess the benefit of a DIY trip is that you can sort of do exactly what you want to do at whatever time, with whatever duration, all those sorts of things. It's very customizable to your ideal trip or adventure. And although they are very logistically challenging, and without any local contacts, prior knowledge or big game hunting experience, it's something that I would actually say is probably best left until after you've had a bit of experience. So maybe that's whether for your first trip, you come up with a guide or an outfitter, get a little bit of experience, get a little bit of insight into what these sort of hunts entail, and then come and replan trips, where you can specialize and focus more on exactly what sort of hunt and opportunity you want to sort of get after that. So what I would say as well is when it comes to guide and outfitters, and considering to use them particularly, I would say it's more beneficial, especially if you're limited to a shorter duration of hunt. So if you've got a really busy work and life, balance or schedule, and you're ideally after what you'd call a trophy buffalo, Banteng, scrub bull, boar, donkey, whatever that animal may be, even if it's a meter barra, and you say, I've only got 3 days, I've only got 5 days, I've only got 10 days, whatever you sort of declare as a short period of time, then putting all your resources into, I guess, a paid hunt where you go with a guide or outfitter is just going to increase your chances of taking that, really special or magnificent sort of animal, relying, and that's where potentially you're paying a little bit more money in the grand scheme of things, but you are paying for that experience, that first-hand knowledge, and even things like gear and everything that we're about to get into. So here are a few factors, I guess, to consider when thinking about doing it DIY. I guess straight off the top, a lot of people talk about, the Indigenous and the Aboriginal land, and often hunting on Aboriginal land requires either a traditional owner or, again, a guide. A lot of guides will lease country from traditional owners through the NLC, and this is, as I said, the NLC is an organisation called the Northern Land Council, and they're responsible for distribution of permits. So even though a lot of the animals that we hunt are introduced, they still require, I guess, management. And that's where the NLC give permits to these guides and whatnot, and they've got to apply for different corporate licenses. So there's a lot of paperwork involved. And that is also common when hunting on Aboriginal land. So that's one of the main area, I guess, that hunts are conducted. Another option is also private properties, and this is something that James and I have explored on many of our hunts. So this requires obviously building a relationship with the property owner or a manager of that property. And just like anywhere in Australia, you've got to be physically granted access to hunt on that property and take those animals. Otherwise, it's obviously trespassing and you're doing the wrong thing. So this is often done in the Northern Territory on working cattle stations. And obviously, as a requirement of that, you being there sort of needs to fit into their work schedule. And basically, you just can't be an inconvenience to them because from working in the Northern Territory the last couple of years as a vet, once the dry season comes around and people start doing all their cattle work and things like that, it's a massive rush. They basically are trying to fit a year's worth of work into 6 months of the year where the countryside's dry enough. You can access certain areas. So there's a lot of work to be done, putting it short. For people looking to hunt the Northern Territory for the first time, I would probably suggest looking into guides and outfitters, not only again for their expertise, but also the opportunities, I guess, to hunt quality animals. Often these places are being managed specifically for an older age class of animal, whereas a lot of the private property that we've hunted, we've had to hunt for many days, often put more time in, more miles, more everything to find, I guess, a smaller percentage of those trophy animals, just because I guess you're dealing with, people such as workers, whoever it may be, not really valuing that animal's life, I guess. And for them, a buffalo is just a buffalo, something to be shot potentially. Whereas when, you've got a young bull on a guided hunting lease or concession, that young bull is a future trophy animal, so it's managed as such and left to get older and basically age. So you've got more of these younger animals getting from year 3, 4, 5 to year 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, which subsequently adds up to being, again, greater quantity of trophy animals. So that's just something to consider. But again, you are obviously paying for these hunts, and they can be some big, high price hunts in the Northern Territory, just because these big game animals are very appealing for not only Australian market, but the international market as well. All of that to be said, DIY hunts, again, do-it-yourself hunts can be super rewarding and often associated largely by people as being these cheaper hunts with less costs. And to be honest, from my experience as both a guide doing the Chiddle Deer hunts and someone that's done a lot of DIY hunts, the notion that these DIY hunts are cheaper can actually be incorrect. And I'll sort of back that up here in a second. But yeah, James and I have done plenty of DIY hunts. And to be honest, when you start racking up and adding up all these costs and the planning and logistics and gear and everything that you need to, one, go and organise and then do these DIY hunts, especially in remote places like Australia's Northern Territory, they can quickly creep up and become quite expensive, where often it's kind of comparable to just saying, why did I add all that stress thinking about it and organising it just to get the same result as if I had been a guest and gone and done it with a guide or outfitter? So that is just something to consider. But logistically, here are some of those costs that I guess you need to think about when considering if you're going to do it DIY. And these are just sort of listing them off. I haven't actually gone and put, monetary numbers next to it, but obviously you've got to fly, and travel to the Northern Territory. So that's either hiring a car when you get there if you've flown. Usually these hire cars as well aren't really rigged out as a functional, 4x4 car with a winch, mud terrain tires, gear storage, whether it's got a tub or a canopy or all this type of stuff. Essentially, they're more likely to get bogged, especially if it's just a small little two-wheel hire car. You obviously want something with a bull bar with so much wildlife on the roads. And that brings us into, obviously, if you drive your car up to do this DIY hunt, and say you're coming from Melbourne or Sydney or Brisbane or one of these major cities, and you're driving all the way west and north to the top end, say Darwin in the Northern Territory, you might be driving 3,000 kilometers, and a tank of fuel or diesel of this day and age isn't cheap. So say you're spending $150 every 600 kilometers, it quickly adds up, and you're spending thousands of dollars just to get to and from the hunting destination that could be spent, on flights and then sort of rocking up and just going with a guide and outfitter. The other thing there is that, I guess, you're limited to what gear you can fit or bring, especially if you're doing a DIY hunt and you're flying over. You might even have to rent gear, whether it's eskies or coolers, tents or swags or whatever. If you're someone like James and I, who have done plenty of international hunts and have all the lightweight, I guess, backcountry hiking sort of gear, then you'll be pretty right. You might just want to add in like a fishing rod to your normal hunting gear, as well as, fortunately, in the Northern Territory, the weather isn't extreme in terms of extremely cold or windy or doesn't snow. So you're less likely to have to bring like your heavy clothing, and a lot of it is your more ultra light sort of gear, but it does still get cold, and there still is, the element of heat and things like that you got to be considerate towards. I sort of mentioned fuel. So even if you're in a hire car, you've got to obviously pay quite a bit of money for fuel. And just a warning to everyone from the east coast of Australia or international, it's around $2.50 a litre once you get over too many places in the Northern Territory. So it is quite expensive. Another added benefit or added cost, are trophy fees. So obviously, trophy fees within a guided hunt are pretty much within the package, and then you can often shoot additional animals on top of that for additional trophy fees. Whereas some private properties, including ones that James and I have been lucky enough to get access to, we don't have to pay like a day rate. We don't have to pay anything unless we shoot a buffalo, and then it's bull prices depending on how the size of that bull. So you have to then also add in, just trophy preparation and the logistics of shipping animals or carting them back home. So again, if you drive up and you've got all the gear packed and everything like that, you've run out of space, and then you shoot 3 or 4 buffaloes between you and a few mates, how are you going to boil those skulls out? Do you just leave them to sort of rot and dry in the bush, and then next trip you'll bring them back? Do you have somewhere to store them with a mate, someone else that can do the trophy preparation and ship them for you? Are you the one that, if you want to get it mounted and taxidermied, that are caping it, carrying the head back and the cape, doing all the salting, all that type of stuff? Whereas obviously compared to a guided hunt, all the trophy preparation and the shipping and all that type of stuff is organised by that outfitter. So another couple of things to sort of not necessarily dive into, but it's just hotels and accommodation. The top end is pretty remote. So even if you do want to stay at a hotel or lodging or something like that, it's often quite a considerable way to then travel to your hunting destination. Whereas, guides and outfitters obviously have good camps and things like that set up with showers and whatnot. So beer, I guess, gifts for property owners, these are things that you need to consider. And then just food. Again, we've found that on these DIY hunts, you typically eat a little bit worse. You can't have as much cold food and meats and veggies and all this type of stuff, milk, whatever it may be, just because it gets more perishable. And as the hunt duration goes on, you're sort of more reliant on things like canned goods, dried foods, dehydrated meals, all that type of stuff, just because ice runs out pretty quickly in the Northern Territory. And unless you've got a pretty flash camp like a guide or outfitter, you're not going to have, angles running hooked up to solar batteries and all this type of stuff. So again, due to all of the above costs and those costs basically creeping up, sometimes, and again, this is pretty vague, this is just a consideration, as I said on the top of the show, but in certain instances, we recommend going with like a guide or an outfitter, especially if you're inexperienced. And again, for us, there are a few standouts in the Northern Territory for guided hunts. These are people that we've been with. So, for example, Dingo Creek Hunting Safaris with Stephen Patterson, or Paddo, as many of you guys may know. We went and did a Banteng and wild boar sort of hunt. He had hundreds, if not thousands, of buffalo also roaming on his lease. up there near Coburg Peninsula. It was truly a hunt of a lifetime. As many of you guys would have seen over the last few weeks, some of the content that we've been releasing, whether it be the Banteng bulls, the boars, dingoes, crocs, just other wildlife and scenery. It's a destination where you kind of go there and you end up just feeling pretty small. Just in general, the Northern Territory has a good way of sort of doing that to you, but especially up there, it's just a next level again. And Paddo runs an amazing outfit, from the food and hospitality and everything, to the trophy potential, and just the hunting experience is next level. It is also worth mentioning Big Country Safaris, who Alex Jaggers is the owner operator of that. He's now got a team of a couple of guides under him as well. So he's just getting bigger and better every year, securing more access through bigger leases and stuff. And he's got millions of acres there in Arnhem Land now. And for those of you that would remember through the archives, Dad and I did a hunt there. I think it was way back in 2019, so years ago now. And we have had a really good relationship with Alex. And again, for primarily buffalo hunts, he's the man to go to. He also has boars, donkeys, does Banteng hunts. I think he's even doing camel hunts now, but Alex is just a wealth of knowledge and has some incredible country there with amazing trophy potential for buffalo bulls as well. And the last one that I think is worth mentioning, that we have a little bit less experience with, would be the Last Frontier Safaris with the legend Nick Joyce. So a lot of people would have known Nick through his social media. He takes some incredible photographs of wildlife, and is definitely one for showcasing what Australia's Northern Territory has on offer. Nick does primarily the Banteng hunts with the Last Frontier Safaris, as I mentioned earlier. And James actually just returned from a trip up there with Nick where he was filming some hunters who went and had a really successful hunt on the Banteng. So again, to be honest, we've had less experience with Nick, but he does have a great reputation amongst everyone that has gone there. So again, they're just a few of the better guides that we know of and can vouch for. And some more. The list would be extensive. There's so many different guides and outfitters popping up and operating in the Northern Territory. As always, just do your research and due diligence. Any good guides with a reputation are going to have tens of people that are happy to, give a referral and that type of stuff. So just do your research, as always, before going on any guided hunt. Are you in the market for serious boots for all feet, terrain and adventures? Well, look no further than Lower Boots. We have been running the Lower Ranger GTX3s for many, many years now without so much as a blister. The team at Lower have extended their generosity to you, our valued listeners, and supplied us with a unique discount code. Use code TWINELEMENTS10 at checkout for 10% off your next order. Wear Lowers on your next hunt. Your feet will thank you. So the next tip or consideration in my mind is safety gear and first aid gear as well, essentially. And I'll start this section off by basically recounting a bit of a funny story now, sort of looking back on it. Although, again, looking back, even something as mundane and simple as this could have really had big consequences when considering how far in the bush I was during this hunting trip. So we all know the NT is super remote. I know this better than most now, especially after working up here for a couple of years on remote cattle properties as a veterinarian. There's limited service, dodgy roads, and again, the untamed environment is pretty harsh to deal with. And this particular story comes about from a hunt a couple of years back, as I said. So it was a solo hunt. I was hunting for water buffalo and feral pigs on a property about an hour out of Katherine here in the Northern Territory. It was a simple weekend mission with work, again, sort of coming up on the Monday. And I drove out there late on Friday night after work and set up camp and basically had a dinner and went to bed. So I then hunted all day Saturday and Sunday morning, returning to the car Sunday mid-morning. So I'd had plenty of really cool encounters on the Saturday and Sunday, seen plenty of buffalo, pigs, what have you, might have even shot a couple. I can't remember the specific details. And for the point of the story, I won't necessarily go into the hunt. But on Sunday morning, I decided to head back to the car and move to another section of the property just to check out, a new zone, as I sort of had exhausted where I was hunting. Now, an important note is that I hadn't actually used the car since Friday night when I first arrived. So obviously a full day had gone past between when I initially set up camp and got there. And much to my surprise, when I went to start the car, the battery was completely dead. So not ideal. And what made this simple enough issue a true problem is that I failed to prepare adequately and I didn't have a jump starter kit. Adding to this problem, I was driving an auto car, so there was auto transmission car, so there was which is also a push start, very modern in today's society, and basically had no, like, even if it was manual, I might have been able to roll start it or something, but didn't have that possibility. Anyhow, the main problem with this and my car being completely dead is that I was approximately 45 to sort of 50 kilometers from the nearest house or homestead, if you would, which meant that I had basically no human contact. Add to this that I had no phone service, again, being quite remote. Silly of me, I had no UHF or radio on me or in my car as well, which I now have. And I also didn't want to use my Garmin for anything other than emergency, obviously setting off that EPIRB. I wasn't at that state yet, but you can begin to see sort of my dilemma. Anyhow, so I'll give a quick version of events here, but basically I came to the decision pretty quickly that I would either sit it out by the car and sort of wait for my emergency contact to realize that I was late and not at home, sort of as discussed prior to this trip. And so for a bit of background, my boss at the time was a good mate of mine. We lived literally a couple hundred meters away from each other, and he knew that if I wasn't home, Sunday night by say 9 p.m, that something had gone wrong. He knew where I was going to be camping and knew to alert the property owners who we did a bit of cattle work for as a vet clinic. And he would have essentially come looking for me. My partner also knew that I was set to be home, that Sunday night late, like 9 o'clock. And if I wasn't home by then, that she would also alert my mate. So there was a few safety precautions set up. So that was in the back of my mind, that if I just sat by my car for the whole day, eventually someone would come to where, I told them I'd be camped, and eventually someone would probably, come essentially save me and get my car started. My dilemma with that was that by the time that all got done, I would have wasted the whole Sunday and probably been late for my work commitments the next morning. So to me, that wasn't really an option, which brought in option 2 in my mind, which was basically to shed some of my hunting weight, leave my backpack at the car with the bow, the camera gear, all of the unnecessary stuff. And basically I just chucked my pack on with all the remaining water that I had and headed for service or the property owner's house, I guess, whichever came first, keeping in mind that I didn't have a UHF or any other means of real communication. So many, many hours later, in the hot Northern Territory sun and the blistering heat, I was approximately 30 kilometres into my trek, heading down the road when I ran out of water. So I'd sort of done my best to save what little water remained. And to be honest, however, in the extreme heat, like even though it was a dry season, it was still probably around 30, 35 degrees. And having a few sips here and there every hour or so, there wasn't really much water left. I quickly ran out. And again, not being prepared and not having the adequate gear meant that I wasn't sort of game to drink any of the water from any of the creeks or any of the cattle troughs on this private property, again, because of the risk of getting even more sick than I was sort of already just dehydrated at that point. So again, I sort of pushed onwards. And again, nearing the homestead after approximately 45 kilometers on foot now, I was starting to get pretty thirsty, and it was now early afternoon. The temperature was still pretty hot. I actually pulled up at a cattle trough and decided to have a bit of a wash. And I was sort of, to be honest, eyeing off whether I should have a bit of a sip of some water that was running and trickling out of a pipe. And I ended up not doing it. But anyway, I did jump in the trough and have a bit of a wash. So you can imagine me shirtless, having a grand old time, refreshing in this bath in the lukewarm cattle trough, when unexpectedly, for all parties actually, this ute rocked up, and with a cloud full of dust in tow, and these two ringers. So for those of you that don't know, a ringer is a term used sort of to describe someone that works up north in the cattle industry, or basically, they're farm hands, they're people that work and live on the property or as part of like mustering crews up there in the Northern Territory. So effectively, these two ladies were out doing a water run just at a typical day working for them. And to their surprise, they rocked up to a water trough only to see me basically half naked, just trying to get out of the heat. So we very quickly got introduced, and I explained my situation to them, to which we all had a bit of a laugh at, and they were kind enough to actually give me a lift into town in exchange for a carton of beer. As it turns out, they were actually heading in there to do their shopping for the week ahead. So that was pretty convenient. It wasn't too much of an inconvenience to them. I was pretty annoyed at myself for making them do it, but they were very happy to exchange a carton of beers in return for the service. Anyhow, I then got my mate, once I was back in town in Katherine, to take me back out to my car, much to his disgruntledness, but he was very good about it. He helped me jumpstart my ute, and then we both headed home just in time for me to basically have a couple hours sleep, and then drive a few hundred kilometres from Katherine to wherever I had to go to the next morning to do either, I can't really remember at the moment, but it might have been some horse, like equine dentals, routine dentals, or even some pregnancy testing on a remote cattle station on that Monday morning. So anyway, all in the life of a mixed practice veterinarian, but you can understand there, with that sort of simple story, I tell that story not so you can sort of laugh at my expense, but instead to get you thinking, about how quickly things can go from completely fine, just having a pretty routine hunting experience, to quite bad. And again, this story is pretty mild. You can hear that everything was fine in the end. It ends up being a bit of a funny story, at my expense, obviously, where I just had to walk out 45 odd kilometers. But basically, I was very lucky, because I urge you guys who are listening to this to consider, what if I'd been bitten by a snake, and without a UHF had no way of, telling someone that, hey, I'm at my car, I've been bitten by a snake. Because that's when time does obviously become a factor, whereas I didn't have time except for that I had to get back to work the next day. What would have happened if I was charged and wounded by a wild boar and was bleeding out, or if I'd actually been at my car and my car was functional, but I'd rolled my car and been really badly injured. There's just so many different variables. So the list of possibilities when it comes to, being in the Northern Territory and adventuring is truly endless. And each of these outcomes are very likely, to be honest, when in remote, harsh country. And I guess we've got to, expect or plan for the worst, expect the best, in most of these cases. So for that matter, the point of this topic is simply to get you guys and girls thinking on a few bits of safety and first aid gear, to have with you guys while you're traveling in the NT on any upcoming hunts. So straight off the list, the top of the list, I guess, in this instance would be like mechanical gear, jacks, winches, all that type of stuff. I'm not an expert by any means. You've heard don't have all the gear or much clue half the time. But just having enough to get you by. That includes stuff like puncture kits for tires. Can't tell the amount of times I've, had to get the spare out, do the puncture kit on the tire that has a small, hole in it, limp back to whether it's the homestead or, back to Katherine, get that other one pump back up, repaired, fixed, whatever it may be, get a new set of tires. But just having puncture kits and spare tires and all this type of stuff is essential when traveling in this rough country. It's definitely not good on gear. And then obviously a jump starter kit. I know Kings, for example, have one that I quickly went and bought. The next day I went and got a new battery for my car and went and got a jump starter kit from Kings, and it sits with me charged 100% in the car, at all times now, and I can charge phone off there. I can charge GPSs. I can charge whatever off that as well. But it is just good to have in the car as a bit of a stash away in case your battery obviously dies or you need something to charge. That also brings us into GPS units and things like the Garmin InReach. Again, I don't really hunt anywhere, whether it's just a little day trip with service. I always carry an InReach now, just for if things truly, if shit hits the fan, you can hit that EPIRB and have people on their way. In this instance, spare water containers would have been really smart. I'd only gone out for the weekend, so I think I had a 20-litre jerry can, and by the time I drank a few Camelback worth and sort of washed dishes and that type of stuff, didn't have much water left for the walkout. But if I had have had water purification tablets, I would have happily, drank some of that water from the cattle troughs. And things like SteriPens, which James and I use on our Northern Territory trips now, but also in America and New Zealand for doing, creek water and springs and stuff. The SteriPens, as we've discussed previously on the podcast, in the gear-related podcast, they just emit UV light, which goes and kills like 99.9% of bacteria and pathogens and things that we're worried about. So one thing I did well in this instance was have, I guess, emergency contacts, where like it was my boss in one instance and it was my partner in another instance, and both of them had a bit of a rough plan as to where I was going. The property owner knew where I was going to be camping, so there was probably 2 to 3 people at all times that knew roughly what my plan was and where I was going. So if they didn't hear from me by a certain point in time, hopefully, in theory, they would have had enough information and enough knowledge between them to sort of work out where to start a search, which, again, it's a great little plan and thought and might keep you warm and cuddly at night, thinking that there are people out there looking after you. But it's going to do jack shit if, again, you've rolled your car and you're bleeding out, or you've broken your leg and you can't even get back to your car or your UHF or anything like this. So that's where a Garmin InReach or something like that really does help, and a tourniquet and these sorts of things. But having an emergency contact, with plans and a bit of a contingency plan in general is really going to help when it comes to hunting in the Northern Territory. And that just, that's people on the first line, people that can actually help. There's no point me telling, someone that has no understanding of how to get me out of that situation, my plans. You have to be open and telling people that can actually, do things and make your retrieval or your safety a forefront sort of plan option. The next thing, as I said, there was a tourniquet. Again, this is something that I hunt with in my backpack at all times. Same goes for snake bandages. These are just non-negotiables. A couple of things in the NT specifically is that you've got to be croc-wise. So, the reason why I didn't go and drink from any creeks is because I didn't want to get near crocodile-infested waters. Even if I had a way of getting water, I wouldn't have been able to treat it, but it is just something to be mindful of when coming to the Northern Territory, is that any water is said to have crocodiles in it, and that's just how you should think and plan and conduct yourself around any water up here in the Northern Territory. As I was sort of starting to come to terms with was probably heat exposure and heat stress. To combat that, I guess you can always wear like a wide brim hat, things like sunscreen, hydration, long sleeve shirts and pants, and even making sure that you've got supplements. So it sounds silly when it comes to first aid and gear and that, but we have so much Atlas Wild on hand all the time just to make sure that we're drinking plenty of water. One, it makes it taste better, but two, it also does work. So there are a few little things there. Less of probably a risk, but something to consider is just wildfires. So being careful of where you obviously park your car, where you're moving through, where you're traveling. Again, if you're on private property, they're probably not going to burn if they know you're out there in a paddock, but at certain times of the year, you can get lightning strikes and things like that, which can start wildfires. And again, they can be pretty significant and move pretty quickly. And just the smoke alone can contribute to a bit of distress, obviously. And then lastly, the NT, especially after the wet season, has some of the most vicious biting insects on planet Earth. And I swear, their mosquitoes are often the size of birds, small birds. They are huge. They're like little dinosaurs. So again, a good insect repellent, such as a Bushman's or whatever, something that spray on, roll on, a cream, ointment, whatever it may be, just having some of that stuff to prevent mosquitoes biting, sandflies, midges, whatever it may be, is often a benefit to you and your well-being.
We have recently teamed up with Day 6. They design and build specialised equipment for hunters. Their arrows and outsert combos are hunt ready straight out of the box. Head to their website to check them out today. Or for our Australian listeners, head to Venture Hunting and Outdoors, who stock the brand.
The next tip that I want to get into is something that is generally done before you get out there, something that James and I have implemented into all of our hunting recently. I don't want to spend too much time on it just because we've covered it to death in previous podcasts, but it is worth mentioning here just because of the size of the Northern Territory and the size of these properties we're hunting. But what tip number 3 or consideration number 3 is pre-scouting. And again, we do this pretty much online through downloadable maps and GPS sort of software. Again, the Northern Territory has lots of country, and only small amounts of that country or terrain actually has animals with it. So again, we like to talk to the property owners, get a bit of an understanding as to where the animals tend to be at certain times of the year, where they see the animals, where they don't see the animals. Property owners, whether it be on the east coast of Australia, in America, in New Zealand, anyone that's a steward of the property or the land is someone to talk to and get information from. Do the same if you're planning on coming to the Northern Territory. The same goes for your guides and outfitters. Talk to them, bounce ideas off each other, and just get as much information from them as possible. The next step is to obviously know where you're hunting in the rough region, rough area. If it's a property, then that's easy. You can sort of, go online and get property maps in some instances. Other times you can download boundaries, things like that. What we advise is obviously it's all good having, service and Wi-Fi back at home or in the hotel or whatever, but you need to be able to download offline maps prior to your hunt and then add your database of information and extra drop pins and all that type of stuff once you're sort of there in the flesh. That's all great, but you have to have that canvas ready to go with a bit of an understanding as to, where certain things are ahead of time. And that's where we often use, obviously, OnX Maps. If we're going to America, it's one of the best mapping softwares on the planet. But to a lesser extent, for $15 here in Australia, you can buy what's called GPS Kit. You've obviously heard us, if you've been listening to the podcast, talk about it quite a lot. We really advise people to get it just for any hunts. Again, we use it when hunting sambar deer in Victoria. We use it up north for chital deer in Charters Towers, North Queensland. We use it all around Katherine in the Northern Territory, up to Darwin, the floodplains, wherever. And again, you just go and do these little caches of downloaded areas. And when I say little, like you can download a 1 million acre property and basically have it where, as if you do have service, you can go and zoom right into little pixels and go, okay, yeah, that water hole actually has water in it. Or, is that a game trail going between, water and whatnot? You can see fence lines, you can see cattle, you can see GPS Kit truly is remarkable for the price it is. To that, you can do waypoints, you can do tracks, you can do all these different things. And again, when we're pre-scouting, not to talk about it too much longer, but we're looking at things like roads. We want to know where fence lines are, where water sources are. That's a massive one for in the Northern Territory, and something that we'll talk about further in a second. You should be able to see, just differences in the topography, differences in is the area really dry? Does it look green? Is it a feeding area? All of these are super indicators for where animals are going to be or might be, and just features that you need to start looking at and knowing for your upcoming hunt. Alrighty, so now that hopefully you've done your pre-scouting again ahead of the trip, we want you to actually get there and get in there, I guess, and begin to actually cover the ground. So covering the ground is our fourth tip or fourth recommendation / consideration. And once again, this is not the time where you put away your maps and just go on blindly adventure. we really want you to rely on your maps. Go and work out like where the rivers are, where the creeks are, where the lagoons bend, what direction, you want to be walking based on what the wind's doing. So you should ideally get there and go, okay, this is where we're camping. This is where camp is. This is where the homestead is. This is where the tracks are. This is where the fence is. Whatever these sort of variables are that are guaranteed. And then you're trying to work out by covering the ground where the animals are. Because again, unless you're on a guided hunt, you're not going to just magically rock up and find animals and be able to just sit there, wake up from camp and someone walk you in on an animal. If you're doing a DIY hunt, and especially a lot of these are done on cattle stations that are hundreds, if not millions of acres in area or size, it's just really hard to find game. So you need to be covering the ground, whether it's on foot or by car, basically, and driving around. So again, this depends largely on the type of access that you've got. If you're on traditional land, where you have access to an area, they might not have as many tracks and roads and these sorts of things and be more of a wilderness area just because they don't have cattle and they don't need to get trucks in and out, or ringers, for example, as we said earlier, don't need to go and do water runs and these sorts of things. Obviously, driving the tracks, if there are tracks on the property with property owners and getting them to show you hotspots and point out the window and say, oh yeah, there's a good water hole down there, and marking these things are really going to help you. And again, covering the property with someone like a property owner or even a mate that's hunted the property before and you're traveling from, Melbourne up to Darwin and he's taking you out to his property that he's got access to, being able to do it with someone who's got a bit of local knowledge, just again, with covering the ground, cuts the learning curve in half. Like, it gives you so much less ground to go and wander and cover aimlessly because you can focus on the hotspots. And that brings us into the age-old rule where a lot of the animals are often in very limited countryside. So think of this as, I guess, the 90-10 rule. So 90% of the animals are living in 10% of the country. You've heard the inverse or, a different rule when it comes to 90% of the elk are killed by 10% of the hunters. And that just comes back to, those 10% of the hunters knowing where the elk are. So again, the NT, Northern Territory, is super desolate and a harsh countryside. So we like to think of it as an abundance of animals. We've all seen the videos and the documentaries and the our videos, for example, and it looks like there's animals absolutely everywhere. And there are plenty of animals, but they're in very, very small pockets of land. Like this whole, the NT being covered in an abundance of animals is a massive misconception. For example, I've walked days on days without seeing so much of the feral pig or a buffalo in certain areas that actually seem pretty likely. And then the very next day I've moved my search radius by, 10, 20 kilometers and found a tiny little puddle of water somewhere with a little bit of green feed. It's an isolated little area, and I've shot 4 boars there, seen 100 pigs, and that's all without moving a few hundred meters. And again, that's that, principle of the 90-10. So 90% of the animals are in 10% of the country. So when in new areas, we really need to cover the ground. And again, for James and I, that often means boots to the ground and going and walking all of this stuff that we've pre-scouted. So we'll go and with our pre-scouting, we might rock up to a property with 100 different drop pins on hypothetical water sources, and we'll go and start ticking them off. And, we'll start with whichever way the wind's going. If there's a spot with a higher density of drop pins that we've identified as good, likely country, we then go and walk through and go take photos, add them to the drop pins so that we've got like a bit of a reference as to what it looks like and what it did look like on maps. And then we can sort of start moving more methodically and actually, again, referring to our map, kind of hone in on more likely areas. If we're seeing a lot of animals around certain looking water sources, we'll continue to look for those water sources. So it's just adding a bit of information to our database, basically. And again, bits of sign like wallows, buffalo crap, pig sign, rooting up, whatever it may be, you want to be keeping an eye out for. And you can be doing this, as I said earlier, by driving if there's like tracks and tracks is in two wheel drive sort of areas, or more maintained roads, or even if it's just walking up and down game trails and things, because a big patch of swamp, for example, might be completely turned up and rooted up by pigs, at one point in time, but then that sign could be 2 weeks old. So you might have to move to the next patch, which could actually be a few kilometers away. And that could be where all the animals are actually now living. So if you just sort of go and are happy to resort to, oh yeah, we found a little bit of sign, but there's nothing there, then you can't just keep visiting those sites. You've got to go and actually cover the ground, look for where the animals are living now, because for whatever reason, the water source or whatever it may be, there's pressure, something's changed. And once you find fresh sign, I advise you to slow down, make sure the wind's right, and actually hunt it. Because I think there's a bit of an urge, I guess, that I've seen in hunters to just walk or drive super quick to cover the ground really fast. And again, that's effective. Like James and I do it at certain points in time. But as soon as you find that fresh sign, you've got to make sure that you slow down, you're starting to glass and you're hunting it really correctly and effectively. Again, because buffalo and pigs, everyone thinks of them as these massive animals that are obviously dark, like a black sort of shade of color. And they'll just be super visible and we'll see them from miles away, and we can drive in the car at 60 kilometers an hour or just walk without doing any glassing. But it's amazing how quickly these big animals can sort of blend into the landscape, especially if they're bedded in amongst some scrub or if there's some dry, long grass. A buffalo and his big horns will literally just vanish even at 50 meters. And a pig, if they just duck behind a log and bed down in a little creek, you won't see them unless you're like really slowly walking and anticipating. So if you're seeing a bit of sign, a bit of crap, bit of wallows, whatever, fresh mud, or in a spot that you just have a bit of a sixth sense and go, oh, this should have animals, just slow down that touch, because there could be a chance that you're scaring them and that's why you're also not seeing them. Cayuga broadheads are engineered for success and built by experience. These are the broadheads we trust for all of our bow hunts. Whether it's buffalo and Banteng bulls in Australia's Northern Territory or chital deer along the basalt wall, we have ultimate confidence in their range. I'm currently loving the 150 grain Zots. Regardless of your preferred broadhead, quality and performance is guaranteed across the range. If you would like to try them today or shoot them already and want to restock, head to their website and use code TWIN10, that's TWIN 10 numerically at checkout for 10% off your next order. You will not be disappointed. We have always heard that water is life, and in this instance, it is strikingly true in the Northern Territory. So again, being extremely vast and a remote landscape, majority of the Northern Territory is pretty dry escarpment country with, a lot of rock, woodlands, open country. And that's where tip number 5 comes in. So we're going to talk about hunting water sources here and just the importance of water sources. And to be honest, these come in an array of different sizes, different characteristics, whether it's a creek, river, floodplain, lagoon, dam, cattle trough. Like there's so many different water sources in the Northern Territory. All of them have massive importance and will vary depending on use of the species. So whether it's a feral pig, a buffalo, a scrub bull, a Banteng, they will all use these water sources differently. And interestingly, in many of these, places and locations that I'm referring to here in the Northern Territory, where there is an abundance of game and wildlife, there's also has historically been like a shared land usage with humans over a long tens of thousands of years' time. So for example, Arnhem Land in the Northern Territory is deeply tied to the Indigenous culture, of course, and Aboriginals have been using this landscape for a long time, well before any white people obviously came along. And that's depicted in their rock art and their dream stories and all that type of stuff. And many of these are based around where water was available for consistent periods of time. So a lot of the billabongs that remain, somewhat permanent water sources into the dry season is where life congregates. So it's really important to think of that relationship with the Indigenous people and these areas that they lived historically, as well as where, these introduced animals are now living is at these more permanent water sources and the areas that do stay, fed by water, because water is life at the end of the day in these examples. So when considering different types of water sources in the Northern Territory, I like to sort of break them down into 2 main types. And to be honest, I'll probably do a separate podcast on this just because it is super important, but just I'll touch on them quickly here just to get people thinking, but I basically think of the first as sort of deep, very clean drinking water holes. And then the second would be shallow, dirty, sort of more wallowing swamps and areas like that. So let's touch on the deep, clean drinking water sources first. Generally on maps, they sort of appear more of a darker blue/green coloration. And when looking through satellite imagery and stuff like that from above, they're often, as I said, you can see that swirl of blue around the edges. And then sometimes they'll have like a greenish sort of algae or vegetation on there as well. But it looks more like a genuine water source, if that makes sense, like something that's more permanent. Often when you go and actually walk these in the flesh, they have, vegetation such as long reeds or kabungi or something like that along the edge, and less vegetation in the middle of the water. There might be some lily bulbs on the edge, but then generally they're bigger water holes with sharper, deeper banks, which mean that less animals are sort of wallowing on the edges. Some will sort of drink in some aspects, but because of these deeper edges, they can only really approach from sort of one section or one smaller corner of that water source, for example. So a lot of it, say 3/4 of the edge of that water source, say it's a 100-meter billabong, 3/4 of it might be devoid of animal tracks, no sign of, trails, anything like that. And then in that last little quarter of the waterhole, one little tucked away corner where the bank's just shallow enough for a little bit less of a decline, is where a lot of the animals will come in, have their drink, and then sort of keep going and moving to other areas. Again, what I've found through experience is a lot of these water holes, the reason why the animal activity seems to be a little bit less than version number 2, which we'll talk to in a second, is probably because they're more permanent water sources. And because of that, they seem to have more likely inhabited by crocodiles, and particularly saltwater crocodiles. The amount of times I've come up to these billabongs and gone, these are stunning. This should be a mecca in the middle of a very dry landscape. And it's almost like it's too immaculate. It's too good to be true. And I think that is often the case because there are crocodiles in them. And again, these are more likely to probably be used by animals like buffalo. The amount of times I've seen like a big buffalo bull sort of swimming out in the middle of it, trying to eat some freshwater lilies or just ducking its head under the water, is far more than I've seen feral pigs on these sort of immaculate, very clean, more deeper sort of lagoons. And I think, again, that's just the risk of crocs. I think a croc is probably, or a buffalo, for instance, is probably less scared or less intimidated by a croc, and probably knows that it can get away with, being in the water to a certain extent, whereas those crocodiles would become, those pigs would become an easy meal for a crocodile the second they go away from that water's edge. And even then it's probably a risk. So that leads us into the second type of water source that I wanted to talk about, which is, again, the characteristics of that more shallow, sort of dirty. You look at it and it's just more of a wallowing sort of a swamp, something that's more seasonal, and something that's likely to recede as it dries up and as the dry season sort of kicks in. And again, typically on maps, so contrasting to the previous example where I said they were green and blue on mapping software and satellite imagery, these appear more of a brownish, yellowy, clay, sort of dirty color on maps. Even to the extent of they'll often be seen as like a series. So rather than one big water hole, it might appear as like a long strip of a low point, for example. So it might be 10 meters difference in elevation to the rest of the countryside. And it's now just a heap of small little ponds that dry up as the season goes on. So it doesn't look like a big billabong, but it might just be a lot of little puddles basically. And these areas are typically lined by a heap of wallows, especially when you've got water buffalo and feral pigs that both love wallowing and relieving themselves from the heat and getting rid of like ectoparasites. You often see a lot more game trails going to and from these areas as well, because if you can imagine, similarly to how I was explaining like a 100-meter water hole in the previous example being only accessed by, 1/4 or one small little section, because these water holes are a lot more shallow, they're a lot more accessible 360-degree view of that waterhole, if that makes sense. So you're going to have a lot more hoof traffic, a lot more hoof marks and animal tracks sort of leading to that water's edge. And then as that water sort of starts to recede and the animals continue to trudge along, breaking down the banks, muddying up the edges, breaking up the muddy water and damaging the soil, there's going to be a lot more sign. So again, these shallow banks are perfect for animals to wade into the water and sort of feed, drink, and wallow. And often they'll actually have really nice green lawns of vegetation around that waterhole for a lot longer distribution compared to those sharper banks, watercourses, where again, a lot of them will have tree line to a certain area, and then the last 20 to 30 meters before the waterhole, it just stops. There's sort of dry earth, and then the waterhole, which is quite a steep bank, I guess. Whereas these are more of a seasonal wetland, which dries up slowly. And as that water sort of recedes and dries up, the soil remains waterlogged enough, I guess, for plant growth to occur. So you're getting animals that are got a good food source, an area where they're comfortable to feed and wallow and drink and all that type of stuff without probably as great a risk of crocodiles and predation, just because the water is shallower. And again, because those banks are shallow, the muddy, the banks, it's easier for them to become muddy and sort of more suitable for wallowing than if you can imagine a really steep bank. It's just hard to make that into a bit of a bathtub. So again, not the best explanations. I'll have to clear that up a little bit in a future podcast when I talk about water sources in the Northern Territory. But it is something that is a bit of a fun topic for me, because I've just religiously used mapping software trying to find, places where I find buffaloes different to where I find boars when living over there, and being able to understand the difference between a drinking waterhole that's clean and has deeper edges compared to these more sort of shallow, dirty, wallowing swamps and billabongs and stuff is very, very different, and something that is integral to finding game.
Numa Outdoors is our camouflage clothing of choice. The team has formulated a durable, breathable, quiet and comfortable camouflage lineup, suitable for all terrains, season and pursuits, with a great pattern to keep you concealed. You may have recently seen us running the Renegade lineup in our recent adventures up north. We're pleased to announce that Numa products are available in Australia, so head to Venture Hunting Outdoors website to check them out for yourself.
I guess that sort of leads us into our next tip, which is number 6. And I'll just quickly touch on game trails here. And again, this is something that, again, if you're good enough at pre-scouting and downloading offline maps and stuff like that, you can find water sources and then see game trails leading from feeding areas to bedding areas and that type of stuff. Because again, buffalo are mob animals. They are often big. They do damage the environment through erosion and that type of stuff. And they can have game trails that are quite visible from the air. So satellite image will definitely pick it up if you're using good enough software. Generally, game trails in the Northern Territory, as you sort of find them, they start off a bit more narrow and generally less travelled the further from water you are. And then as you get closer to water sources, for example, one of those, shallow sort of muddy water courses where they're wallowing, buffalo and pigs are wallowing, they become wider. So more animals, if you can imagine, it's like a road. It's like a road network. If you can imagine a small little street where not many people go down has, a single lane, and then you jump into a double lane and then a triple lane. Then soon you're on the highway as you're going into the city, which is more of a hotspot for people. And if you can think of the water source as a hotspot for the wildlife, the game trails that are closest to it will be wider and generally deeper. And that's just more and more foot traffic. So again, even though buffalo are massive and they're capable of walking through and smashing down the scrub, they're going to want to take the path of least resistance. That's just common in most animal species on the planet. So again, I've watched plenty of times, countless times, water buffalo will often walk into the same water source from the same way, and then often walk from that water source to their, feeding area or bedding area and leave the exact same corner every single time. So This can sometimes be dependent on the wind and pressure, obviously, but if left undisturbed and you're just a bystander watching what they do and go about their habits, they'll often follow the same little circuits. And I guess knowing this and knowing where these game trails lead and come from and whatnot can be really, really important. And again, if I'm, say my mapping software isn't the best, and when I go there and actually put boots on the ground at a certain place or a station, one, I love just traveling on game trails because that's somewhere that I anticipate animals are going to travel along. They're generally quieter, easier to move along, all these types of things as well. And that's just something that I think, don't take for granted. If you're trying to work out a new bit of property, even if you're traveling between one likely spot and the next, don't just bush bash. You're going to waste energy. You're going to be loud, all these types of things. Get on a game trail and just use that network. That will often take you to the next hotspot, or animals will often come into your path and sort of intercept you as well. So tip number 7 is fire and regrowth. And this one is actually more important than you might think. Again, Indigenous or Aboriginal people have had fire regimes, and this has been a massive, deeply embedded part of their culture. And it's also very important for ecological management systems here in Australia's Northern Territory. It's been practiced by Indigenous people for tens of thousands of years. And these regimes certainly aren't like random burns. It's not just people going and flicking matches and burning, millions of acres of the countryside willy-nilly. They're very, very deliberate. It's often in correlation with certain times of the year, very seasonal, and often localized to little patches of bush that, need this burn to occur. For example, a burn that will help sort of shape the landscape, promote biodiversity. It might even create an access, certain plant species in Australia's Northern Territory, and a lot of the dry country in Australia actually need fire for their seed banks to sort of regenerate. And again, because of this phenomenon where, people have been burning the land, and not just people, naturally there's been fires and things in Australia. It's a country that thrives with fire and low fuel burns and things like that. Both the land and wildlife and animals have sort of adapted to live with wildfires and also thrive where this regrowth occurs. So some of the benefits, as I sort of touched on a little bit there, are just like general ecosystem health. So again, through fires, we're maintaining, I guess, like that country that's open. We're preventing woody, sort of very thick country, a lot of this scrub and dense scrub that grows very quickly, dies, and then is sort of just clogging and, quite woody. With a light fire burn, you can actually get rid of that and then encourage new, fresh plant growth for grazing animals or for animals in general. Again, that's very much associated with a fuel load reduction, I guess. So you're going and replacing all that real dense woody country and woody sort of scrub with less of a fuel load for later in the year when the dry season continues. It just lowers the risk of like a worse fire occurring later on. And then, of course, the whole reason why I'm mentioning, fires and regrowth and that type of stuff is for the hunting benefits. And that's, as seen by the Indigenous people for many, many years, whether it was to sort of flush animals from areas that they'd lit deliberately on fire, and those animals would then flee that in a certain direction to, whether it be people that were ready to hunt them, or even to, if you think of it from the other side of things, if a lot of the countryside going into the dry season is quite dry, the grass is dying off and that type of stuff, the Indigenous people would actually burn areas, and that would attract animals to that regrowth, say kangaroos, for example, at a later date. So that if they knew that they burnt a certain area, a week later, 2 months later, 1 month, whatever that time variable is, they would go back and hunt that, hoping that kangaroos and things would come into the area. So fire was often used in conjunction with hunting practices. I guess this is seen very similarly, culturally in South Africa and other places in the world, in fact, where parcels of bushland are burned, again, in an effort to reduce that sort of dry, less palatable grass and promote newer sort of green pick, as I like to call it. So when I think of that green pick, again, this comes back from a veterinary perspective and whatnot, that green pick is sort of that new grass that's growing, and it's more like less stem and sort of coarse textured material and more leaf, because when I talk about palatability, it's like the leaf that animal want to go and eat, basically. It's the same as, a corn cob, for example. You want to go and pick all the little corn kernels off the cob, but as soon as you get to the cob, you want to throw it away. It's the same as these animals. They want to go and eat the fresh, lush green leaf and throw away the stem. So as I was sort of alluding there, this green pick, as I described, sort of comes up through the soil, and it grows as either, sometimes in the dry season, it's still quite cool in the mornings, there's a bit of a heavy dew, or there could even just be adequate soil moisture coming out of the wet season, which is what that grass will often grow back from. It doesn't necessarily require rain. And obviously if it does rain, you do get like an out of season rainfall. It's going to help promote that growth, but it's not required in many of these instances, which is important when considering what time of year the fires are generally done. And that's at the beginning of the dry season, heading into the middle of the dry season. And some of these key characteristics of these deliberate fires, which are sort of complementary to hunting, include that the burns are often quite small. They're very much patchy and they're staggered over a period of time. There's no point just going and burning the whole of the Northern Territory in one big hit, because then you've sort of got no, unburnt refuge for animals and plants to sort of exist. You do want, what we call a bit of a patchwork or a mosaic sort of burning method to take place, where the best way I can explain it is if you imagine like a chess or a checkerboard, and each black square represents a burnt section of land, you want that to be bordered by basically majority of white or unburnt patches. And that's where that chess or checkerboard sort of example comes into play, is where each sort of opposing color is, it's guarded by an opposing color. And that's that mosaic sort of pattern coming into play. And again, as I said, a lot of these burns occur in the early dry season, sort of if you think of that between sort of April and July, when the vegetation is just beginning to dry off. And a lot of it's quite tall, like it might be knee height, waist height. But what's important here is that under the soil, the moisture in the soil remains pretty high, so that you can go and do what's called like a cool burn and basically get rid of all that dead, drying off sort of vegetation. And then underneath the soil, not only does that drop a lot of minerals and things like that into the soil and help with that, but then as there's seed bank and all that type of stuff dormant in the soil, that fire gives it an opportunity for new growth to occur. And then that's what a lot of these animals flock to. So again, I've been preg testing all over the Northern Territory throughout the months of, later in the dry season, say August to October. And I've seen firsthand many times these uncontrolled sort of destructive fires. And then the comparison between a small grass fire that's deliberately lit in April, May, compared to some of these, uncontrolled fires that get out of hand just because someone flicked a cigarette butt out or whatever, something's happened, a lightning strike has occurred. Some of these fires that happen later in the year when the fuel load is uncontrolled, some of the fire fronts, for example, are 100 kilometres wide, just ripping and roaring and literally burning tens of thousands of acres of bushland and animals and causing significant damage in, a single day, for example, which is extremely destructive. So all of this to say basically that when hunting during the dry season, it's worth asking the property owner if you're on private property, or even knowing where burns have occurred, and just mentioning it to you guys. Like, have you guys got any areas that have, recently burnt? And for example, that links us into an example here where way back in, I think it was 2019, Dad and I went and hunted with Alex Jaggers from Big Country Safaris, and we started the hunt and saw a really nice buffalo bull quite early on in the piece. And we saw this bull, noticed he had really nice horns, was a solo animal, like living solitarily in a dry sort of rocky escarpment. And this country was pretty noisy, pretty harsh. And we basically followed him from a couple 100 meters away and just followed him for literally probably 5 kilometers in this really dry, thick country. We nearly lost him a few times, but we were able to sort of recircle and find him ahead of us a couple 100 meters. And Eventually, to be honest, he just kept going, kept going. He had his head down. He knew where he wanted to be. And eventually, like finally, he stopped and he fed onto what was a little small, vibrant patch of this green grass, this little bit of regrowth that we talked about earlier that was probably 1 to 2 inches high. And compared to like all this dead brown grass that he'd just traveled through, as soon as he got onto this green, sort of palatable short pick, the bull just stopped in his tracks and was happy to just sit there. And he basically sat there and fed for like 2 or 3 hours, which allowed us to basically do a stalk and put a stalk in on him. And then from there, we were able to obviously take him and Dad was able to shoot him and was rewarded with an awesome trophy. But again, that just shows the importance of knowing where these burns are and where fire has sort of previously gone through. And again, there are grasses that are like every grass is different. Mitchell grass, spear grass, kangaroo grass, some of these, to name a few, are going to be really important for holding game compared to something like a spinifex grass. And then obviously if you go up to the floodplains in the Northern Territory and you find para grass, which is an invasive species, that's going to be so much more valuable than even those kangaroo grass that I mentioned earlier, which is a native sort of very palatable grass. So they're just some things to consider. And again, the more knowledge you have regarding this type of stuff is just going to help with your hunting more so. Bringing target precision to hunting camp, Option Archery makes specialist gear. Their quiverizer is one of our favourite bits of kit. The stabilizer combined arrow quiver is extremely unique, cutting weight with its clever 2-in-1 design. The Option sights are versatile in this regard also, offering both a single or multi-pin sight housing within the same sight. Shop their products today. I think we're up to tip number 8 now, and this tip is going to be purely based on my anecdotes basically, so not based on any science or anything like that whatsoever. It's purely done through plenty of note taking and observations from my time in the Northern Territory. And that is going to be that the middle of the day is prime time. So I believe that hunting in the Northern Territory, prime time is basically going to be from later in the morning and closer to midday and then onwards through the early afternoon. The amount of times that I've gotten up well before dawn and waiting for the crack of, first light and daylight to come, only to hunt all day, and where I start seeing animals is actually around lunchtime. So that first, 6 hours of the day from 6 a.m. just say until about 12 noon, it's honestly as if all the animals in the scrub are sleeping or they're lying dormant in thick cover, only to sort of emerge as the day heats up, I guess. And again, it seems to be a bit of a thing where it probably comes down to there just being so much countryside and so much scrub. And again, if the vegetation's high after the wet season, it's really difficult to pinpoint animals until they probably do come into water. So again, that focusing on the water sources and feeding areas is really, really important, but also timing it so that you're not there too early or too late and you hit that water source or that likely area at prime time. So again, I've been to swamps before, sitting there at first light many, many times without so much as a feral pig or a buffalo inhabiting them. And then I give that same spot a few hours to warm up and the day sort of, come in, set up. And then after 10 a.m. to between probably 2, 3 p.m., it is as if it's just a pub and that's happy hour. All the animals begin to emerge and feed and come in for a drink and a wallow. And again, I'm not necessarily sure why this is. However, to the point, if I had one time to be on a certain spot that I think the animals will ultimately be, it's going to be between midday, early afternoon. So I'd say between 11 and 2 p.m., I'm going to be on that hot spot. So wherever I'm finding the fresh sign, thinking that animals are moving, all that type of stuff, I want to hit that between 11 a.m. and 2 p.m. in the afternoon. And most of the time you're going to be rewarded with animals moving, feeding, wallowing, that type of stuff. I don't know why it is. Of course, James and I, we often hunt all day just because we enjoy seeing, other scenery, looking for sign, putting the puzzle together, and enjoy just the other wildlife encounters that we sort of get by being up at first light, going and finishing the hunt after dark. However, it's definitely worth mentioning that when it comes to what we would consider prime time, it's that middle of the day period. And it is interesting purely because it goes sort of against what other, most other ungulates are like. And for example, many of them are crepuscular, meaning that they're active at dawn and dusk. And again, ungulates are like cloven hooved animals, so your deer species and all that type of stuff. When you think of a red deer stag or a fallow buck or even a chital deer, they're going to be active throughout the night, dawn and dusk, which is a stark difference, in my opinion, to these buffalo and boars that live here in the Northern Territory, which again, I just think prime time comes in at that sort of, 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. It's when I've had the most successful stalks, when I've sort of been sitting on a swamp and animals just seem to arrive. And then again, once it hits at 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, it's like they go, okay, cool, we've had our wallow, we've had our drink, we've had our feed, now we're moving. And once they start moving and heading off those game trails into the thicker scrub, it can be really hard to like intercept them and get back in front of them. And again, you hit those water sources, you hit that spot at prime time, and it seems to be just better hunting opportunities. Tip number 9 is probably something that I could have spoke about earlier when considering the Northern Territory, because again, typically when I think of the Northern Territory, I typically think of 2 main seasons when considering the top end of Australia. And it's not really summer or winter, as we sort of describe a lot of places like geographically, and think of like, times of the year as summer. A lot of people are doing their summer at the moment in Europe, and they'll come back and do their winters in certain places and whatever. Up here in the Northern Territory, it's classified as the wet or the dry. And that does obviously line up with summer and winter and stuff like that. But here are a few factors that characterize each period. So when we think of the wet season, you want to be aware that it occurs most commonly from November to April. And generally that's considered the like not peak time or off time, unless you're a local and you're living in the Northern Territory sort of permanently. What characterizes the wet season is that it's extremely hot and humid with lots of rainfall, obviously making up the wet part of it. From there, you obviously get a lot of lush green grass due to all the regrowth and many grasses growing very rapidly just with the abundance of water. It's often characterized by floods, and much of the Northern Territory and the top end being inaccessible. A lot of the roads are underwater. And then even after the raining stops, some of these places don't dry out long into the dry season. And that sort of brings us to the dry season, which obviously occurs sort of just after the wet or in conjunction with the wet. Whether you're thinking of it before the wet, after the wet, it's the next thing that comes along. And you've got that occurring in May to October. So May through till October. And again, this is the ideal time for people to generally travel around and adventure in most instances. Again, the fishing can sometimes be better during the early wet season, during the build up and that type of stuff. Whereas for most people trying to travel around, visit, see the sights, all this type of stuff, the dry season is going to be largely considered the prime time or the peak activity time. Just because, again, physically, the weather, the temperature is actually a bit cooler. You get these crisp mornings and evenings, which come about, and then you get these glorious sunny days. And to be honest, it's more of a manageable heat during the day. It still gets up to about 30 degrees, but it's not that hot, humid environment that the wet season is sort of associated with. Again, another thing that's kind of appealing is that there's very minimal, basically to no rain during the dry season. And that results in very dusty, dry conditions. And again, dusty and dry means easier to access and get to these remote places. And one of the benefits when it comes to the hunting that we've talked about earlier with the water sources and things, and even the prime time, it's all got to do with animals concentrating around water sources in the Northern Territory. And as we said earlier, water is life. So I didn't really want to talk about seasonality too much, but it is a bit of a consideration. Again, if you want to come up and experience the build-up, it's going to be a completely different hunt to a peak dry season hunt. So that's just something to be aware of. And again, if you do very sort of rostered, structured work, and you can only get up to the Northern Territory during the wet season, it's just going to be something to consider in terms of accessibility and the type of hunt you're going to have compared to a hunt that's based in the middle of the year when you can get to most places and do a basically totally different hunt. So both very cool, different opportunities and different characteristics that make each of them pretty fun and rewarding. The last key point that I want to mention today and actually put quite a bit of emphasis into is knowing the anatomy of the animals that we hunt. And tip number 10 is, I'm just going to call it big game hunting. And again, when dealing with big game animals such as water buffalo, banteng, scrub bulls, and wild boars, it is vitally important to know exactly where the vitals are. So knowing your anatomy on these animals is very important. Secondly, you need to be extremely confident in your gear. So obviously coming up, making sure you've shot your rifle, got all your stuff dialed in, your scopes ready to go. You shoot your bow leading up to the trip, all this type of stuff. Ideally, you don't just become a new bow hunter and go and bow hunt buffalo, because they are, quite frankly, can kill you. They're called dangerous big game for a reason. So that also leads us to obviously shooting to kill. And, as a bow hunter, we need to be considering, adequate arrow weight and arrow spine, making sure that we can get adequate penetration, that the draw weight we're pulling back is enough for piercing through the heavy armored skin, meat, bone. Even if it's a buffalo or a boar, we've got to think of, the mud that they're encrusted in some instances if they've been wallowing. And the same goes for a rifle hunter. You just need to have the right and correct projectile. And again, if you're doing a DIY hunt, then there's more emphasis on choosing the right gear and being prepared. If you come up with a outfitter or a safari, they'll obviously have all the information there to give to you guys. But generally with your rifles, you want a higher power rifle, something that's going to have more stopping point. And then with your arrows and things like that, again, like something that you're happy to shoot and you've had good experience with on fallow deer might not stand up to a mature buffalo bull. So just knowing, the limitations of your gear is extremely important. And that brings us into the main takeaway here, which is that I just want people, when they think of hunting and shooting animals in the Northern Territory, focus on the first shot as if it's the only and your last shot. And when I say that, I want you to think of, again, these are dangerous game for a reason. And I want your hunt to basically go from shooting an animal to finishing with a dead animal. Because what happens is when you take that shot and it's a marginal shot, or you rush the shot, or you weren't prepared, or you're using inferior gear, and you take that shot, the hunt doesn't stop. It then goes into a dangerous realm where it becomes a tracking job. And if you understand what I'm trying to say there, so if the hunt doesn't stop with you having a dead animal at the end of a really good blood trail, or watching that animal go a few short meters and die, and that shot that you've taken, as I said, your first shot, you want it to be your last shot and the only shot. But if it does become a second, third shot, or a first shot and the animal's now gone into heavy, thick scrub, you don't want it to become a tracking job, because that's when things start to go badly most of the time with wounded animals, especially when we're considering these dangerous big game. And that's just something I wanted to sort of finish this podcast on, I guess. But before we do that, I did also just want to talk about a few very succinct differences, I guess, between the species. So buffalo, starting with them, are probably more inquisitive. I'd say they're very inquisitive, and they're more curious than most of the other big game animals. So they'll often actually catch you or see you, and they'll start to come in. And that's where often front-on shots can be an option, especially if you're calling them in, which is a tactic. But you just have to be aware, I guess, that buffalo do have extremely thick skin for both the arrow or projectile to penetrate through, being up to about an inch in some of the areas around the neck, shoulders, those areas where they're fighting. And again, if they're wallowing and they're often covered in mud, then that can just add to that sort of body armor that they have. The next species that I'll just talk about would be Banteng. You could probably liken scrub bulls into this group as well. Again, these guys have thinner skin than the buffalo, so you probably don't need as heavy a poundage and broadheads and stuff like that. But obviously a good cut on contact broadhead is going to be great for all of these big game animals. I'd be using more of a solid sort of probably 2-blade, less than a 3-blade, or less than a mechanical or an expandable broadhead. But again, Banteng in general are very, very quick on their feet, and they're definitely more cautious and alert than a buffalo. And I think personally, similar to a scrub bull, are probably more aggressive and more likely to sort of charge you than a buffalo, just without any reason to. Like a buffalo, if shot, will obviously charge you, but I've hunted them a little bit now. Again, not as much as obviously the guides and outfitters who are professionals, and they always tell you to keep your wits about you, but I've been less cautious of buffalo. They seem to be more curious, whereas I've had scrub bulls just, charge for literally no reason except for they see something or smell something that they don't like and they'll put you up a tree. Whereas buffalo seem to be a bit more, oh, hey, what is that? Oh, what is that? What is that? What is that? Oh, shit, it's something, I'm going to leave. And they seem to be a bit more curious, I think would be the way to put it, rather than aggressive. And the last one I just wanted to talk to in this instance, were boars. And again, feral pigs, they're often covered in mud from their wallowing. One thing in the Northern Territory, which is pretty cool, is it's often close quarter action. And again, because a lot of these instances, it's due to the cover and thick vegetation in the Northern Territory. There's often bedded shots allowed on these animals because they're often located in wallows or the edges of swamps or creeks and stuff like that. So the last thing I would say when hunting these pigs is sort of know your shot angles, and knowing how your gear performs under these shot angles and knowing where to hit the animal is really important. And this is probably a good conclusion because we'll talk about this in our next podcast, which is bow hunting bedded boars, where James and I are going to dive into our recent trip to the Northern Territory with Paddo from Dingo Creek Safaris, where James and I went and hunted. And basically, I think we shot something like 11 or 12 boars in a 2-day span, all in excess of probably 80 kilos with a couple inches of hooks. And we just want to talk to some of our takeaways from that hunt. But that wraps up all of our top tips for the Northern Territory today. We will have a quick break and get on to the next section. Embark on an unforgettable journey with our fully guided Chiddle Deer hunts, catering to both rifle and bow hunters. Spotted Safaris is conducted in the heart of the Basalt Wall region, North Queensland, Australia. We specialise in catering to all experience and fitness levels of our clients, providing trophy stag chiddle hunts as well as beginner focus adventures and meat hunts. With over 15 years bow hunting chiddle deer, our guides know these animals and the grounds they hunt like the back of their hands. With chances at a mature basalt boar as a bycatch and some spectacular wildlife viewing, there really is something for everyone at Spotted Safaris. Inquire today by emailing spottedsafaris@hotmail.com or simply send them a DM on their socials. Alrighty, so that brings us to the FAQ segment today. If you guys have any questions following this podcast, please send us an email with the subject line FAQ to info@twinelements.com.au, or simply send either Twin Elements, Ayden Doumtsis Outdoors, or James Doumtsis Outdoors a DM via Instagram or any of our other social media pages. And of course, we will strive to answer them on a future episode of the podcast. This week's question was sent in via Jesse Lyons. So Jesse says, "Hey guys, I shot my first deer on the weekend. I noticed that the stag was riddled with mange. I'm not too sure, so I thought I would ask the experts if the meat is safe to eat. Thanks, guys. I love the podcast and keep up the great content." So thank you very, very much, Jesse, for the kind words, and congratulations, my friend, on your first deer. To hear that it's a stag as well is very cool, and we actually got a photo from Jesse and it was a nice red deer, which is pretty cool. So that's obviously got to feel pretty good. As far as this question goes, I guess, and the safety aspect for eating the meat from this affected deer, my main thoughts would be that if it's only affecting the skin or the outer parts of the animal's hide in the form of this mange, then I would personally say, or assume, I'm assuming in this instance because I haven't seen it myself, that the underlying meat should in theory be safe. This is of course understanding that mange in most often the case is caused from like ectoparasites like mites, and ectoparasite meaning outside of the body. So you can think of ticks, lice, fleas, mites as ectoparasites. So in theory, my assumption would be that it's probably fine to eat the meat underneath, like that in theory the meat should be safe. In saying that, it is always worth any animal with a parasite burden, and a mite in this instance, which is causing the mange, is a parasite, the same as a worm would be a parasite, or a tapeworm in a bear, or whatever, a tapeworm in your dog, or a tapeworm in a human would be a parasite. If an animal is inundated with any parasites or has any parasitic infestation, there is always a cause for concern. So what I would suggest here is do a very thorough physical examination on that animal, or not necessarily thorough, like physical examination like you would as if you're a vet like myself, but so long as there are no other what we call systemic signs of illness within the body. So as long as like you go and check all the lymph nodes and make sure that all the other organs appear sort of normal and healthy and happy, that would be like my main tip, just to assess if that meat's going to be edible. And then once you've harvested all that meat, if that's all good and the organs and lymph nodes seem fine and there's nothing, once you remove the hide, as you would normally do when preparing the meat, if everything seems, fine, then what I would do is continue by freezing that meat for another 2 weeks and then cooking it adequately as per any game meat or anything like that. And I'd personally have no issues with eating this deer that Jesse's mentioned. And again, I will say to this, for Jesse, if he wasn't sure and had any reason to suspect, any different than what I've just said, and that deer was infected or something was going on that I haven't seen or assessed, then I'd just simply leave it. Our health as hunters and people is obviously going to be more important than harvesting that meat, as good as it can be, like in this instance. So they're my thoughts on the question. Please continue to shoot them in, guys and girls. We appreciate getting them. I know that James and I really enjoy seeing our DMs and emails and stuff like that. And it can be genuinely about anything, even if it's topics that you want to hear on the podcast. We're trying to cover a range of them and keep the information coming to you guys. Lastly, a massive thank you to Venture Hunting and Outdoors, who we are partnered with for hosting their recent Hunt Fest this past weekend. So for those of you who attended, it was great to meet many of you legends and also answer some of your questions during our daily discussions and panel meetings that we had as part of the day's events. James and I hope that you all enjoyed the day. Hopefully some of you won a few gifts and prizes, and most of you hopefully saved on some epic deals and got kitted out in some of the best brands in the hunting industry. For those of you that listened to this podcast and missed out on it this year, if next year is anything to go by, then stay tuned for the next Venture event. The team at Venture is dedicated to striving to make the hunting and outdoor community here in Australia bigger and better with every opportunity. So make sure that you guys are subscribed to their newsletter, subscribe to their website for deals and all that type of stuff, and become a part of their ever-growing hunting community. As a valued listener to the podcast, you can now shop on the Twin Elements website and receive discounts on your prints. Simply use code The Twin Elements Podcast for 10% off any print orders on the Twin Elements website. As I said earlier, we have over 40 prints to choose from, so there's literally something for everyone. They make awesome gifts for friends, family, whoever, you name it. We've got images of deer all the way through to water buffalo, fittingly for this podcast, and even native wildlife such as birds for people to enjoy. Our 6-part Northern Territory adventure has been going off on our YouTube channel. We're getting heaps of really positive feedback and lots of views and everything there. So thank you all for sharing that one. Make sure that you guys head over there if this podcast gave you a little taste of NT hunting and adventure, and make sure that you subscribe for all future releases on the YouTube channel. We have a couple more water buffalo, Banteng bull and wild boar hunts to drop from our NT hunt last year, and then we're going straight into our USA sort of a vlog. We're going to give a rundown of sort of the mentality, thoughts, everything background behind this USA trip, where James was successful in taking a bull elk. And then we're going to keep running into the early part of 2026 with our red deer raw footage from this year, which is sure to be absolutely epic because we had an amazing adventure. Lastly, before I sign off, I just want to say, please continue to subscribe, review, and rate the podcast. James and I truly appreciate your guys and gals' support that we're getting on this podcast. Again, we really love putting, our knowledge and just things that we think are important out there for you listeners to consume. And we love getting the feedback. So, this is quickly becoming one of the favorite ways for us to get out to you guys and getting our knowledge to you and having it in a digestible sort of format. So I just want to say thank you very much for your support. I hope you guys enjoyed this podcast and I can't wait to join you all next week for the next one. Thank you, legends. Bye.